Well, Lisa Mayfield, I can't tell you how excited I am to have you on this podcast. For everybody listening, you should know that I have another podcast, the Shrimp Tank podcast, where Lisa was just a guest on. So you get the double header with Dan, Lisa.
I'm up for it, Dan.
You're
We
up
had a
for
great
it.
time last time, and I anticipate the same thing today.
Well, the reason I'm so excited to have you on is because of what you do. You work with people, families, individual, anybody who is dealing with aging. And of course, we're all aging, but as we are living longer, there's some challenges associated with that. And I think people listening know a little bit about my story and my parents both being in assisted living, and everything from my dad had cancer to my mom had frontal lobe dementia, and everything with assisted living and memory care. I want to touch on that, but it's interesting, Lisa. I talk to clients, I talk to friends, I talk to people who are around my age, and it seems to be everybody's going through something like this with their aging parents. And so this episode, we're really talking to baby boomers and the Gen Xers, where
Mhm.
we are, you and I are in
Yep.
that category, about dealing with aging parents. And then secondly, talking about how they can prepare. So to get started, I want people to understand you're young, you're younger than me. How did you get into this business?
Well, Dan, I revealed on our last podcast that I just had my big 50 birthday. So I'm thrilled that you still consider me young. But I
Well, I'm getting
had my
close to my 60. I'm in the fourth quarter of the 50s. So I remember turning 50, and I can't believe it was almost 8 years ago.
time flies, as they say. I've had my business aging wisdom for 20 years. So when I started it, I guess I was pretty young. And so I had worked in the mental health field for a long time at that point in time and kind of stumbled into working with older adults. And I had always been, I don't know, had a passion for older adults. I was really close with my grandfather. My biological father wasn't really in my life, so my grandpa was particularly important to me. And then in high school, I was working on a big Girl Scout project and volunteered in an assisted living community and got really close to two of the residents there. So it kind of planted the seeds for this kind of work later on in my life.
And I'm so glad you're doing it. I remember being a kid, and the premise was people die in their 70s, and boy, if they get into their 80s, they've lived a long time. That is not the case today. I mean, I think maybe the fastest growing demographics must be people in their 80s, 90s, and even into hundreds and living vibrant lifestyles. However, there's a lot of folks who, for whatever reason, are challenged because either through some sort of failing health, or something as insidious as dementia and Alzheimer's. They're, people who are their children, us, are finding that we're having to now deal with parents who no longer are taking care of us, or are those, kind of those figures. We're having to deal with some really serious issues. What would you say? I'm going to kind of give you some frequently asked questions that I get. What would you say to somebody who says, okay, I'm in my 50s, my parents are in their 80s, they seem to be doing fine, they're doing all sorts of things. What do I have to worry about?
Mhm. And I will say, I'll answer that, but I will say, when you were talking about us living longer and how much longer we might be around to have our kids be assisting us, more recently, most of the people we've been working with at Aging Wisdom have been in their 70s. So,
Oh,
and these are people in their 70s who are having earlier than expected health issues. So
okay.
that might look like a stroke or Parkinson's or memory changes that are happening in the 70s. Maybe it's some heart issues that are pretty significant. So it's not always just as, the people we think of as old, because I think people in their 70s are still young.
I
But
do
no matter
too.
what, yeah, no matter what the age of your parent, I think the things to be on your radar, just knowing, and I'm sure you've talked about this in your podcast, just acknowledging how stressful it is when your parents are aging, and especially if you're trying to work and run a business and you're worried about your own kids and family. I know you're a recent grandfather, so they call that the sandwich generation when you're worrying about both sides. So just one, knowing that it's overwhelming and not to feel alone. I think the other piece is trying to find openings to have a conversation with your parent. I like to talk about things in the future. It's much less intimidating if you say, "Hey, mom, I know someday you might need help, and I'd love us to just talk about when and if that day came. God forbid something happened to you that we didn't anticipate. Let's talk about what you would want to have happen. Do you want to stay home? Do you think about moving? Have you done your legal paperwork? Do you have enough finances to pay for whatever plan you want?" So just opening the door to have a conversation like that, I think, is incredibly important.
So I want to stay on that for a second because I couldn't agree with you more. Yet, from personal experience, from personal experience, uh, that even though you say that, a lot of times the parents will say, "Oh, I don't want to talk about that. We'll deal with that when we get there." You know, that's yeah, that's I don't want to I don't want to talk about it. And a lot of times it's they don't want to be vulnerable about it. They may not want to give some information. They don't want My dad used to say, they're going to just carry me out of here feet first.
I
And
wouldn't bother.
they did, but it wasn't because he was dead. It was going to the hospital, to which he never returned to his house again. So those types of things. But how do you then, if you're in the position of the child, you open up with those great words, and you get a lot of pushback saying, yeah, well, you're right. We need to talk about it, but we'll do it later, or we'll do it when we need it. How do you deal with that?
So I think one that's not unexpected. That is a typical response, and I think two things come to mind. One is trying a slightly different line, which is knowing that we serve as consultants to families navigating these issues, and there's people like us all over the country, and we'll share a website to find someone like me somewhere in the show notes. But having a facilitator of those conversations can
Yeah.
make it much easier. So saying something like, "Hey, I ran into, this person who can help us, think ahead. And I know you're not worried about it, but it makes me really worried. And I have so much on my plate. It would just make me feel better if I knew what was available to help you if that day came." Sometimes putting it on, like maybe they'll do something for you, even though they won't do it for
Right.
them.
You know,
So
I wish I knew you 11 years ago. I can just tell you, I wish I knew you, because I think that that's a great way, because it's a little more subtle, but it still gets to the point. You know, we ended up becoming caregivers for my mom after my dad passed away, and that's really hard. And I think unless you've experienced it, it's hard to really understand the depth of caregiving. My dad didn't have to do it because he passed away before she really got into the dementia. A lot of times you'll see one of the spouses, so maybe your mother or your father, becoming the caregiver for the other. And then in our case, both parents start heading downhill at
yeah.
about the same time. Can you talk a little bit about what you see in your work with caregivers, whether it's the spouse that's also aging at the same time, the stresses on them, and how to help that parent? And then if you're forced to have to try to make some decisions because both of them need it.
Yeah, great questions. I just met with a family this week where both parents are needing assistance. The dad has some I think they're both in their mid 70s. Dad has some dementia that's becoming more significant, and mom, as the caregiver, is starting to have her own health issues, some challenge with the knee. She has diabetes. She's just finding herself exhausted and tired. And so the two kids, who both live out of state, are really worried about them and trying to get them to be planning and accepting a bit more help. And what I like to talk to families about, because you're exactly right, is caregiving kills people. It's so bad for your physical health, it's incredibly bad for your emotional health. So when families come to me, I often say, the person with dementia, unfortunately, we know their path. It's pretty predictable, it's progressive, it unfortunately will only get worse. There's not a whole lot we can do to alter that path other than focus on quality of life. But the caregiver, we have full control over their life. And so I like families to focus on the well spouse, the caregiver.
Wow.
What do we need to do to take care of them so that they don't go, down with the ship, as you might
Right.
say. Okay. And the caregivers, as you, I'm sure, know, they're not thinking about themselves. That's the last thing they're thinking about. So when you asked what they can do, it's almost trying to figure out what things can we get off of your plate to make your life easier. And it could be little things like getting a housekeeper in the house, or having someone that could help with meals, or someone that could help with the yard keeping. It might not be helping with caregiving. It might actually be getting some of the other pieces off their plate.
So it takes that stress of whether it's cleaning the house or mowing the lawn, it takes that stress away.
And I would say most people I meet of that generation, the baby boomer and maybe the silent generation, they don't often hire help. So
Right.
unlike younger generations, they're less likely to have a housekeeper, less likely to accept help that younger generations are more eager to accept. So just whatever pieces you could start to get off their plate, and often just helping and finding one thing at a time to get off their plate. I think when we try to throw all sorts of help at them, it becomes overwhelming, and they might, it's more easy that they might, no, I don't want any help, get out of my
Right.
way. But I also think trying to get adult children and their parents connected with support groups. I think support groups can be incredibly valuable for caregiver spouses in particular, so that they can build a community, realize they're not alone, ask for help, vent all their feelings.
Yeah, we actually we learned about the support group after my mom went into assisted living, and it was, even though we were no longer caregiving, it was incredibly important. Talk a little bit about this, and this was the second part of my question. Okay, let's say maybe you have one parent that's passed on, so you only have one parent or both parents, and you find yourself now, it's either you're caregiving or you're gonna have to hire somebody, or there's a combination of those. What are some of the signs? Because sometimes there's a like this fog of war going on. What are some of those signs that maybe would be helpful to realize? Okay, this is either getting above my pay grade, or I need to get some help in here.
Yeah, great question also. So typical signs that somebody might be shifting. One is keeping track of what does the mail and paperwork look like in your parents' house. If you start to see, a table or a desk with lots of mail piled up on it, what happens when your memory starts to change, it's much harder to differentiate what's junk mail, what's a bill, what's
Right.
important, what's not. The rest of us, we take, 99% of our mail and we toss it in the recycling or we shred
That's
it. It's
right.
very clear. But when your memory starts to change, you can't decipher and it feels overwhelming. So you keep everything, you can't make a decision. So watching for piling up mail, maybe unpaid bills, maybe some scrapes or dents on a car. And
Mm.
driving is probably a whole nother topic to
Yeah, that
tackle.
we could do a whole topic on driving. So I'm gonna have you back. We'll talk about driving another time. But you're right. Yeah.
um, food in the fridge. Is there food in the fridge? Is it
Oh,
rotted? Do you have, does it seem like they're making themselves a meal? Are they eating? Do their pills look organized? Do they know what medication they are on? Is it a mess with meds? I think also another one might be starting to repeat themselves, where you're like, Mom, you already told me that, or
Right.
asking you questions that you know that you've already answered 3 times. So those are some top
And I want
ones.
to let me hit on that. I have another question. I hope I don't forget what the next question is, but what you just said was important. I know that for me, in work dealing with my mom who had dementia, it was hard, even when I logically knew that she had dementia. I know that I got into arguments with her over things that I had no business getting in an argument, because number one is she didn't know. And number two is it was worse for me. As my wife Barb told me one time, she goes, she's going to forget it in like 15 minutes and you're still angry about it 3 hours later. And so I think it's that taking away that you've seen your parent your entire life in
Mhm.
one vein, transitioning into, okay, this isn't their fault and it's not them.
Yeah. Your questions are so right on. You can tell
I
that you've
lived it. By the way,
been
you
in the
can tell
middle
I
of
lived
this,
it.
because I think part of it is, and I will say it's far easier said than done. So
Oh yeah.
whatever great wisdom I say, I know that it's easier said than done. Is part of it is just what you said, acknowledging. Then people often skip over this, is the sadness. Like, acknowledge how sad it is, how much yucky it is to watch your parent declining. So just trying to acknowledge that within yourself. Also, giving yourself some grace and forgiveness for being impatient, because it's impossible to be perfect. It's a natural response. So I think being kind to yourself. And then when somebody's memory is changing, it's really that their brain is damaged, and
Yeah.
often the brain is actually shrinking. So sometimes I like families to think about like a brain in their hand and watching it like shrink. And sometimes I think that visualization helps people remember that it really is not their fault. Like, they cannot control how they're responding, and kind of visualizing that. And I think the other thing is how you have interacted with your parent for 56, 58 years, 50 years. You now suddenly have to interact with them differently. Like,
Yeah.
they're not going to change, you have to change. And
Right.
change is hard for any of us. But I was with a son this last weekend, watching him with his dad, and I was trying to share a tip with him. I think it might be helpful if you say, no, my dad wouldn't say that, it doesn't work like that. And I was, that's how your dad was. That's how you interacted with him for all the years you've known him.
Yeah.
But now he's a different dad, and you're going to have to interact with him differently.
One of the things that I share with people, when my mom lived with Barb and me for 2 years,
Mm.
and then it became obvious when we were sleeping with the door open so that we can make sure that she had a walker, that she wasn't going to fall. It became obvious that we could no longer do that, and we moved her to a memory care. And I shared this on the other podcast. I'll never forget how heartbreaking it was when my mom looked at me with, at that moment, about as much sanity as she'd had, and said, "You're leaving me here?" And yeah, but it was incredible because I shifted from a caregiver to her son again.
Mhm.
And I remember being in a support group, and people saying, you can now come in, and if she's not in a good mood, you can leave. You can say, "Okay, mom, I'll see you tomorrow," and leave. I often found too that I'd go visit other people because their parents, and we would discuss, "Oh, your parent is so nice." "Really? Your parent's nice." And it was amazing. It's an incredible transformation.
Yeah.
Okay, so I need to transfer to my other question before I completely forget it. And it really
Wait, I
regards,
wanted to acknowledge that
okay,
I love that you brought that up last time and this time. Is that is such a distinction. I got to be a son.
right. Yeah, it's really huge. And you feel, I'll just say that you feel like you have this obligation to have them at home and to care for them.
Mhm.
Really, the obligation is to be a parent and a child. I think that in the end, that's really the obligation. So I'll tell you, Lisa, I was when my dad was still alive, but he was no longer in the house. Both of them were in the assisted living, and so I was in his house because I was in charge of his finances, and so I was going through things. I was looking at stuff, and I said, "What the hell is this?" It was a life insurance policy. He had told me he didn't have any life insurance, so I took it to him. I said, "Dad, what's this?" He goes, "Oh, that's right. I got that in like 1972 or something." And it was a life insurance policy, and it was important because I was able to actually take some of it early for his care, that we were able to use, and then after he passed away, my mom was able to take the rest. Can you share a little bit about what we should all be looking for and having that conversation when it talks about wills and life insurance, and what are, I just named two, but what are some of the others?
Right, and I mean, I think you asked earlier, what can you be doing if you're a baby boomer yourself and looking ahead, or you're helping your parents? And one of the absolute most important pieces is that people have done their legal paperwork, met with an attorney to look at your power of attorney documents, who can make decisions on your behalf if you're no longer able for medical, finances, your advance directive or living will, which is there's same form, different names, that talks about what you want to have happen at the end of life. Do you want life support? Do you want a ventilator? CPR, no CPR? And then the third document is usually the will, what you want to happen to your things.
Yep.
Most people are focused on the will, which in my opinion is the least important. It's the power of attorney that's really crucial. And if people meet with their attorney or their financial advisor, checking in with them as well, they should be helping check off the box. Do you have long-term care insurance? Do you have life insurance? And just helping them, and therefore you, get organized for all those details.
It's funny. One of the things that my dad was very good about, we got the power of attorney for the bank and all of his things very early on for me, before he needed it, probably 5 years in advance, just because he had to do that with his mother, my grandmother. And so he was very much attuned to that, and we got that done. And just this last week, I got a letter in the mail from Wells Fargo. He was with Wells Fargo, and it had his name and mine as the power of attorney. Well, they had sent a check for $16 because I remember all the Wells Fargo stuff that went down. They said, "You haven't cashed the check." I never got the check, but the post office, I figured out they knew mine somehow. I got the notice that I hadn't cashed the check, so I had to call them, and they said, "Oh, we're sorry for your loss." It was like, well, it was 11 years ago. But the fact that I was on that power of attorney triggered for them, I was at least, my name was there. Otherwise, it's going to be who knows where it ends up. That power of attorney becomes incredibly important, and it's not something that can be acted on quickly, because if your parent has already slipped now into dementia, you need that power of attorney done when they're of sound mind.
Right. Absolutely. And when I talk with people, one of the first things I ask about besides finances is, have you done that legal paperwork, or has your parent? And most of the time they're so annoyed that that's what I care about, because they called because their mom fell or their mom's driving and they're worried. But that document is crucial, that
Yep.
if there isn't a power of attorney in place, or there's one missing, or there's no one named to step in to help, the adult children are, their hands are tied. They're almost helpless without that document and that ability to have that legal authority. And most families don't know, have their parents done that document, who
Right.
is named as the power of attorney. And so it really is a crucial piece of paper.
So I have two more questions that I want to deal, and we can take as much time. You're going to have to promise me we're going to do another one of these. We'll probably do the driving. You know, I talk about my situation a lot. I was basically an only child. I do have half brother and sisters, but they live in other places, and I had full autonomy. So all the decisions were between me, myself, and I got great support from my wife, and we dealt with all of that. I know that there are families out there with multiple siblings, and even in the best of relationships, there's a tremendous amount of stress, anxiety, and strain on relationships where you have multiple siblings, everybody wanting what's best. And so I'm not even thinking of, any bad stuff, but everybody wanting the best, but everybody having a different idea of what the best looks like.
Mhm.
Can you share a little bit of advice for those where there's siblings involved, all wanting the best for mom and dad, yet having to kind of come together and not get back into when they were all teenagers, into those roles that they had, right?
Right. And you and I talked a little bit about this last time, that even the most healthy families, families where all the adult children get along normally, something about when your parent ages, it just brings up all the old stuff, as you mentioned, and people shift back into what they felt like then or what the dynamics were. And it becomes a mess. And I've worked with many families over the years that don't see eye to eye, from just not seeing eye to eye a little bit to not even being able to be in the same room together. And I think realizing that, like you said, that they all care about their parent is the first thing, but they all have different perspectives. One son might be living in New York, one might be next door. So how often they see their parent makes a
Right.
big difference. But I like to talk about, there's a kind of this continuum between independence and safety, and where the different siblings fall on that line helps lead to their perspective. So it's trying to find out, where are they on that continuum, and how do we find middle ground? And that means, like, the son in New York says, dad wants to be independent, that's all that matters, so it's okay that he's falling or that he's having car accidents, versus the daughter next door who sees him all the time
Yeah.
and wants to, like, my business partner always said, wrap them in bubble wrap, keep them fully safe, 24/7 care, like nothing can happen. Like,
Right.
how do you fall in the middle? And we tend to fall, try to get families in the middle. How do we keep them safe while honoring independence? And it can be helpful to have a neutral outside professional weigh in about what they think the parent needs. And that can often make a world of difference with the siblings. To hear somebody share what they think is needed and why can help people get on the same page a little bit more.
So I'm going to end with this question. In part of my professional work, I have access to help people get long-term care insurance, and that's been a hot topic here for a while. I'm not going to ask you about insurance, but my point to people was, yeah, you're buying this young because it's less expensive, first of all. But I don't care if you're in your 40s or 50s, you probably still should start thinking about what happens when you're in your 70s, 80s, even 60. What's that going to look like? It might seem like it's a lifetime away, but time goes by fast.
Right.
What are some uh, pieces of aging wisdom that you have for those of us who are in our 40s, 50s, early 60s, have children, maybe adult children that someday may need to be taken care of us? What are some things we can do now that we should be doing now?
And related to finances, particularly the last couple years, and with the labor shortage, the cost of care has really escalated. And I think it's important for people to have some sense of what kind of costs we're talking about. And as you know, working in the insurance industry is, statistically, it says that the majority of us will need some sort of
Mhm.
help at some point in our life. Statistics say that number is around 3 years that you would need that help.
That's correct.
I personally think, and I see people needing it much longer, but
I do
we'll go with
too.
3 years. Right now, I would say the average cost of, well, I will say, to have caregivers round the clock in somebody's home, and these are Seattle prices. If people live in a city, these prices are pretty right on. If you live outside the city, it can be a bit less, but it's around 20,000 a month for
Yep.
full-time caregiving. So
Yep.
that's a month. So you do 20 times 12, you do that times 3, it's a substantial
It
amount
is.
of money. And then if you're in assisted living, it can range, I'd say now the average is probably 12,000 a
It
month
is.
in assisted living.
Your numbers. Those are, I mean, and that's today.
Yeah.
And my message to people, those are not going down over the next 15 to 20 to 30 years. They're just going up.
Yeah, because as you know, the baby boomer population is huge. The
Yep.
population of caregivers is not enough for
Yep.
that generation. So there's going to be a huge shortage, which can drive up the cost of that care. And so when people think about how much money do you need in retirement, they're often thinking about, your living expenses. Well,
Right.
if they're lucky, they're thinking about their lifestyle. And I hope people are thinking about traveling and having fun. But
Right.
then you have to think of how much is your health insurance going to cost.
Right.
And then on top of that, this care, these crazy prices I'm referencing are on top of all those other things that we've mentioned. So I think people vastly underestimate how much money they're really going to need in their, kind of retirement.
And so I think, just to summarize, think now about financially, how are you going to pay for it? And also start thinking about what what the lifestyle is and what your plans are and what you would tell your adult children. This is, I mean, right now, we've told our kids, hey, we trust you. We trust you. I don't know what we're going to be like in 30 years or in 35 years, or what we're going to think, or if what happens to us, but we trust you. And you have to know that now. And I think that even just giving that confidence to adult children is important.
That permission.
Yep.
And I know a lot of people will say, especially baby boomers, oh, it doesn't matter when I'm like that. You can just, knock me off. I'm not going to need
Yeah,
that care. And it's not going to happen like that. You are going to need
it
that
does.
care,
Yep.
and that burden is going to fall on your children, and you sometimes can be that financial burden.
Yep. All right. So, how do people, somebody listening to this, there's somebody who's saying, oh, I have to call Lisa. I have to call because it's so important. Uh, Tell people about your website, how to reach you, resources you have, all of that.
So our business is Aging Wisdom, and our website is agingwisdom.com. And we're in the Seattle, kind of Bellevue, King County area. And we have lots of great resources on our website. For anyone that lives outside of that area, you can find some of my colleagues at the Aging Life Care Association, and that's aginglifecare.org. And there's a directory to find people. But I'm also always happy to find some of my colleagues. If people reach out to me, I happen to know most of them personally, and always happy to make that connection.
Well, Lisa, thank you again. We're going to have you back. I'm going to make you promise me we're going to do one on driving as you age. I got stories on that, so
I bet you
we'll
do.
talk about that. Thank you very much, everybody out there. Check out all the resources, because Lisa's right. We're all going to get there. It's not going to be exactly as we thought, and we're all going to probably need some help along the way. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. We'll see you next time.